Hey, what's up? This is a very unusual video for me. I have something quite complex to talk about, and I'm going to try to state it very succinctly after recording longer monologues on the same topic. I'm recording this, by the way, in Chiang Mai, Thailand, but this video is not about the fact that I'm in Chiang Mai, Thailand. It's not about what's going on with veganism in Chiang Mai, Thailand. I already have some reflections like that posted to my Patreon, and I will talk about that a bit in future here on YouTube as well. This video is closer to the core issues of effective activism, of how do we make a positive change, how do we organize politically for ecology, veganism, animal rights, etc. A large part of what we do as vegans, from the perspective of political science, is a boycott. B-O-Y-C-O-T-T. If you're vegan, you may have never heard the word boycott. Vegans generally don't describe what they're doing as a boycott, but politically, that's what it is. What does boycott mean? Boycott means that you're refusing to buy something yourself, and you're encouraging others to refuse to buy it also. Some kind of social movement, some kind of activism. Maybe you have protests in the street telling people not to buy these things. So when I was a child, many people wanted political change in South Africa. To simplify, what they wanted was for South Africa to be less racist. And they tried to pursue this political change through boycotts. These boycotts were promoted with street protests, interviews on the news, articles in newspapers and magazines. But a case was made, was presented to the general public. Look, South Africa is an immoral country, it's a deeply racist country, and we need to do our part. We need to do something positive. By refusing to buy certain things, we can put some kind of indirect pressure on South Africa to change, to be less racist, to change its government. Now, whether or not this is actually effective is really another question. What the effects are for the people participating in the boycott is what I would here draw attention to. More recently, when I was an adult, only a few years ago, there were a lot of people who wanted to boycott Myanmar, a country formerly known as Burma. They felt that the human rights situation in Myanmar was so terrible, the civil war situation, in reality, Myanmar was in a situation of civil war for many years. They felt that this was so negative that the outside world should put pressure on Myanmar to become more democratic through a boycott. Now, obviously, this didn't work. And part of the problem, is whether or not boycotts can really bring about these kinds of political changes. But part of the problem that I'd here emphasize is the effect on the activist as an individual. If you're a vegan, do you become vegan to cut yourself off from the brutal reality of animal agriculture, or do you plunge yourself into it? Do you face up with it? Do you engage it? Are you a vegan who would never visit a zoo, who feels morally pure? It's, oh, no, I boycott these things. I would never set foot in a zoo. Or are you a vegan whose activism involves visiting many zoos and of being really aware of and really well informed about the differences between zoos in different countries, the laws that regulate zoos, the questions of animal rights in practice, the questions of zoos doing captive breeding programs for endangered animals, the different guidelines for, are zoos just preserving animals? Are they trying to return them to the wild? Are they perhaps torturing the animals, or are they forcing the animals to perform like trained animals performing in a show? I can very well imagine a vegan being engaged in, devoted to, and dedicated to those issues, and for that reason, very frequently paying the money to visit a zoo, because that for them is part of their activism, is part of how they educate themselves. Now, likewise, if you're actually trying to change South Africa, going to South Africa would be part of that. If you're trying to change Myanmar, going there would be part of it. And simply boycotting it, simply saying, I don't buy anything made in South Africa, or I don't buy anything made in Myanmar, for one thing, it's insufficient to cause social change. But for another thing, you are cutting yourself off from that reality instead of being engaged with it. And obviously, boycotts involve not doing business with the other side that you're boycotting. But someone in a very humble line of work, someone like I remember I met a guy who worked in advertising. He was a photographer and took photographs for advertising. And he lived in Myanmar. And naturally, he learned a great deal about political conditions there. And he goes there and sees it and engages with it. And in some ways, he was in a better position to advocate for social change at least to have an informed opinion than someone who stays outside of Myanmar and says, oh no, I'm too morally pure to come down to your level. I'm too morally pure to go to the slaughterhouse or to go to the farm, to see for myself, to get familiar, get acquainted, and be engaged with these things. I find it problematic that the boycott leads us to think of ourselves as isolated individuals at the center of a circle. An isolated individual at the center of a circle of harm, trying to shrink that circle of harm, trying to reduce the harm being done. That is part of what we do as vegans, but it can never be adequate. It can never be effective as social movement. It definitely, these other examples, it can never bring about the end of a war. It can never cause a transition to democracy. It may be meaningful for you personally to refuse to buy something for ethical reasons. I totally relate to that. I do it myself every day. There are all kinds of things I refuse to buy for ethical reasons, not just due to veganism. If you think something is being manufactured in a country that has slave labor, it's natural that you're going to want to avoid buying that. But the real challenge is to instead think of yourself as an isolated individual in the middle of a circle of influence, and of trying to expand that circle of influence to actually change the system around you, not just to reduce the harm you're doing by passively contributing to that system, by passively being a part of that system, an economic system, social system, etc. Now, I can use examples that involve war, and I can use examples that are directly related to ecology. Right now, the quality of this video is lower than usual because I'm filming in Thailand and we're using these new ecological light bulbs. They supposedly save electricity, are better for the environment. They supposedly use less mercury or put less mercury in the environment. I have read that. I don't know if that's true. You could never bring about this social transformation. You could never bring about the transition from a society that uses the old-fashioned light bulbs to the society that uses the new light bulbs just through a boycott. It would never have that outcome, okay? And think about practically the maximum percentage of the population you could actually motivate at any one time to be boycotting the other type of light bulbs, to say we refuse to buy the old light bulb. If you got 5% of the population motivated to boycott one type of light bulbs, that'd be a great accomplishment. If you got 30%, you would have one of the largest social movements in the history of the world. It's very unlikely. And for us as vegans, again, the percentage of people you can get who are passively meat avoiding, passively semi-vegan may be high, may be significant. Again, you can look at the caste system in India. You can look at the history of Buddhism. Religions have proven that they could motivate a huge number of people to be vegetarian or semi-vegan or even outright vegan. Yes, okay, maybe. But the type of social change we want to make, especially if it's within our lifetimes, is probably going to involve a very small percentage of the population being motivated to actually bring about the change. Obviously, the switch to the new light bulbs was only possible because someone made a convincing case to the government, to the governments in many countries, and made a convincing case to industry. Look, this technology, people are still going to be able to read books. It's not going to destroy society. It's safe. It's reliable. It works. And it really brings about these ecological benefits. So we need you to take some kind of action to change the system. And of course, that could be tax incentives from the government, could be guidelines and regulations, it could be laws ultimately making the less efficient light bulbs illegal. Depends on how gradual a transition you want or what have you. And ultimately, of course, there are public education campaigns connected to these things. This way of thinking, of being engaged with the problem, engaged with the industry, and of putting together a convincing case that we have a substitute that works. That's very different from the boycott model or the boycott mentality. Engagement is educational, both for yourself as an activist and for the people around you, the people you engage with. As I say, for me, the advantage of actually going to Myanmar, instead of just boycotting it, or actually going to South Africa, is who you are, who you become as an individual, how much you know, how you feel, that you've seen it yourself, that you really have something to offer as an activist, as a leader, or when you give an interview to a newspaper or something, that you really know this stuff. You're not just sitting at home feeling morally superior and refusing to buy something. And The outcomes you can't control. Maybe you never achieve your outcomes, but out of that engagement, you changed as a person. It's very rare to meet someone who actually visits prisons. And I have met and spoken to some of those people. At different times in my life, I've wanted to be involved in prison activism, activism to improve prison conditions. And I've met and spoken with people who have experienced that kind. One guy, very memorably, a white British guy who did that in Laos, People's Democratic Republic, of actually going to the prisons, seeing the conditions of the prisoners, talking to the wardens and the jailers, and finding out how the prison system works. If you don't actually go there and do that, that's a subject I don't think you can learn what you need to know from books. I'm a big fan of book learning. A lot of what I know about the world I learned from books, but there are some things you only really know from going there and doing it yourself. And many people feel, even if they have read about it, that until they actually go to a slaughterhouse or until they see certain aspects of the ecological or ethical sides of what veganism is all about, that they don't really know it. So part of what I think is dangerous about the boycott mentality, although boycotting and more active activism, they're not mutually exclusive. You can do both. I think as vegans, we all aspire to do both, is that the boycott can lead you into attempts to be pure, attempts to withdraw yourself. And then once you've adopted that mentality as your fundamental political praxis, you also get into problems of where does this end? What is the objective? What is the end goal? And I've been talking to Jake Eames lately, and he struggles with this, like emotionally and personally. He feels that he can't justify buying items made out of plastic. I got one right here. It would be much better if we could transition as a society away from using plastic of this kind. But again, that would ultimately take government regulations. I couldn't possibly do it on a boycott level. How can you justify wearing cotton? Cotton has massive ecological impacts. Of course, it kills insects. Unless you're kidding yourself as a vegan, you must realize the use of pesticides and just process of agriculture itself kills animals, kills insects, what have you. It is what it is. He is thinking of himself as that isolated individual at the center of a circle of harm and of trying to shrink that circle of harm as much as possible. And what I'm trying to say in this video is to instead think of yourself as the isolated individual who's working to overcome that isolation so that they can expand their circle of influence, and so they can use that influence to fundamentally change the system. I don't really like the fact that I rely on these bottles, even if they're recycled. And I know there's a superior technology. Disposable plastic and disposable aluminum. Aluminum has massive ecological impacts, high intensity. The production of it is energy intensive. There's a lot to say about aluminum. Technologically, any society can make the transition to having standardized reusable glass bottles that are collected, washed, sent back to the industries, relabeled, refilled, sent out again. And that is exponentially better for the environment than having a glass bottle that is melted down and forged into glass again, or having a piece of plastic that is melted down and forged into some other plastic object. Washing and reusing glass bottles is so much better for the environment than using an aluminum can for the purpose of transporting Coca-Cola from a corner store to your apartment, perhaps only a few meters. There's no justification for that. But how can we actually bring about that change? It will never be accomplished through a boycott. And if you could actually motivate just 5% of the population to be passionate about refusing to buy aluminum cans, it still won't bring about the change. If you could motivate 30%, it still won't bring about that change, right? That change is only going to come when people institute a new system. And it's almost certainly going to involve the government or come from the government. If not, it could come from a donor like Bill Gates. A millionaire could instead be leading this kind of systemic change. But ultimately, you need a social organization that's going to provide guidelines for these bottles, that's going to distribute and collect and redistribute these bottles, that's going to incentivize industry to reorganize itself. Because these companies, the Coca-Cola company, the Pepsi company, they'll make money either way. They're happy to compete either way. But who is going to lead that process of social change away from the plastic and the aluminum into using reusable glass? That is an intervention that changes the system. That's not an isolated individual just trying to shrink their own circle of harm, right? And again, everything I talk about on this channel, at the humblest level of 5 vegans getting together and trying to have a pancake stand to promote veganism, or trying to illustrate a children's book about veganism, or engaging in public education, or protest, or lobbying government for change. All of these things, what I'm emphasizing is that process of engagement and organization leading to systemic change. Even though I do engage in the boycott, I'm boycotting meat, milk, and a million other things right now. You have to appreciate the powerlessness of boycotting as a method, that ultimately it's a sort of pathetic method of pursuing social change. And I would say also the danger of the boycott mentality is that boycotts allow people to delude themselves into thinking they're members of a mass movement, when in reality, totally diverse and divisive groups of people are united by the boycott without really being united. So when we had the boycotts against South Africa, there were extreme left-wing groups, including communists, and there were right-wing conservative groups that were all opposed to racism in South Africa. Now, apart from just normal conservatives, you can imagine a traditional black church in Georgia, African Americans in a conservative church in Georgia, they might have been activists on this issue, opposed to racism in South Africa, the apartheid government of South Africa. They want to change, engaged in this boycott. And at the same time, there are left-wing communists, totally different political ideas, but also respecting different leaders. They have no common leadership, no common organization, no common social movement, but they are united by the boycott itself without really being united, right? And that's a large part of what's going on right now in veganism, right? And my heart goes to these people. I get email recently from Poland, from Muslim majority countries in the Middle East. I get email from all parts of Europe, obviously from America. I get email from people in different countries all around the world who are trying to organize vegans into effective activists of some kind. And of course, one of the first stumbling blocks they come on is these people have nothing in common. How do you organize them? How do you get them together and so on? Again, this struggle is at least exacerbated by the boycott mentality. Of course, you could be in the opposite situation of having a very narrowly defined movement that has trouble reaching out to other people. That's not the situation we're in. Veganism in 2016 is internally divided, divisive, fragmentary. There are conservatives, there are liberals, there are a lot of people who are ex-anorexics or people just trying to lose weight, vegan for health reasons. There's such a weird diversity of motives bringing people into veganism that, yes, it's an enormous challenge to move past the boycott mentality. And yet, there are no two ways about it. I mean, in the next 10 years, that is exactly what we have to do.